Okay, so for this next video lecture, so we will be discussing about the other forms of sampling techniques that may be used for attribute sampling. So again, attribute sampling is normally used for testing of internal controls where the auditor is concerned about the characteristics, okay, of a certain procedure or subject matter. Okay, so audit samples are usually designed so using a fixed size approach. However, other techniques such as sequential and discovery sampling, which do not use the fixed sample size, may be applied. Okay, so if you could still remember in our previous discussions about the sampling techniques, normally um, there is a determination of a fixed size of samples to be taken from the population. Okay, however, in this case for attribute sampling, the auditor can also use other techniques which which do not use this fixed sample size approach. Okay, so for the first technique, the auditor can use also this sequential or stop or go sampling. So this is a technique where the auditor will choose a single or a group of items in the given time interval, and then he will conduct the examination, analyze the result, and then audits another group of items if needed, and so on. Meaning, once the auditor selected an item for evaluation and he evaluated it and analyzed it. So depending on the results of such samples, if he will still undergo or perform additional uh, testing or examining of the next group of items. Okay, so that's how sequential or stop or go sampling is being done. So, in other words, it involves sampling plan for which the sample is selected on several steps. Okay, with the need to perform each step conditional on the results of the previous step. So that's what we have mentioned. Okay, depending on the result, if the auditor will still perform additional procedures or take additional samples. Another sampling technique that the auditor can use is the discovery sampling. So here, a discovery sampling is sampling plan which selects a sample of a given size and then accept the population if the sample is free of deviation. And he will reject the population if it contains at least one deviation or occurrence. Okay, so meaning depending again on the result from the sample, if uh, the whole population will be accepted or rejected, or will be given a conclusion which is modified or unmodified. Okay, so with discovery sampling, the auditor may not be interested in determining how many deviations there are in the population. So normally, this is, as mentioned in the previous slide, if there is only one deviation occurrence, then it will be considered already by the auditor. So this is often used in situation where the auditor expects population deviation rate to be zero or near zero, and hence a single occurrence is very critical. Okay, so that's where this discovery sampling is applied, or this is when discovery sampling is applied. So if a deviation is detected, then the auditor must either use an alternative approach. Okay, or if the deviation is of sufficient importance, then he will audit all the transactions. So that's discovery sampling is. Okay, meaning the auditor is just concerned even if in a single deviation, okay, he will make any revisions from the original audit plan procedures. Okay, so those are the other forms. Okay, two forms of sampling techniques that may also be used for attribute sampling, which do not use fixed size sample. Okay, so we will continue with the steps involved in the variable sampling. Okay, variable sampling, on the other hand, is concerned on the amounts of the account balances. Okay, so here are the different steps, okay, for the variable sampling. First, the auditor should determine the objective, okay, for a certain test. So variable sampling is normally used for substantive testing because in this case, the auditor is concerned about the values or the amounts of the accounts, and its conclusion is generally stated in terms of pesos and quantities. So after the auditor determined his objective, he will define the population where the samples will be taken. So the population should consist of the items constituting the account balance or even a class of transaction of interest. So the items that are individually significant for the sampling risk is not justified, uh, should be tested separately and not be subjected to sampling, because in this case there might be deviations that exist there. That's why it should be separately tested. Okay, the next step is to select an audit sampling technique now. So the auditor may select either the value weighted selection, which also is called as the probability proportion to size sampling, or classical variable sampling. Okay, so as we go along, we will discuss them as well. Okay, next step is he will determine the sample size. Now, after the auditor chooses that the sampling technique, he will now determine the sample size. Okay, so the auditor should consider the factors that affect the sample size, especially for substantive procedures. Next step is the auditor will determine the method of selecting the sample. So usually random number sampling is used. Okay. Next step is the auditor will perform the sampling plan now. Okay, so here the auditor should perform the appropriate audit procedures to determine the audit value, okay, for each size identified. Then after that, he will evaluate the sample results. Okay, so the auditor should project the results of the sample to the population. Okay, if indeed the results can be inferred to the population. And lastly is he has to document the sampling procedures. Okay, of course, this is very important. So each of the prior steps and even the conclusions that the auditor reached should be documented in his working papers. Okay, for this will serve as a proof and a support on his audit opinion, and he may also use that in the future engagements as well. Okay. So in this video lecture, we will continue with the next topic, which is about the factors in determining the sample size for substantive tests of details. So how or what are the factors that the auditor needs to consider for the sample size, okay, for in the case of substantive test of details. So auditor's assessment, okay, of risk of material misstatement is the first factor. Okay, so here, the higher the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement, meaning this is based on the inherent and control risk, okay, so the lower the detection risk the auditor should accept. Because in this case, he should lower his detection risk so that the overall audit risk will also be lowered. What does this mean? Meaning, if assessed risk of material misstatement is high, the auditor has to do more substantive procedures to gather more audit evidence or to detect these misstatements. And then, how did he do it? Okay, so he should detect this misstatement. So that's why his detection risk should be lower. Okay, this is the only risk that the auditor can control. Okay, you could still remember in our discussion before about the audit risk. So hence the auditor should increase the extent or even the sample size should be increased as well. So more sample size should be included in the evaluation to detect more misstatement, okay, of the substantive test of details. Next factor is the use of other substantive procedures directed at the same financial statement assertion. So here, the more the auditor relies on other substantive procedures, such as analytical procedures at the same time, this is the purpose of this, of course, is to reduce the detection risk, okay, and to reduce it to an acceptable level. So the less assurance the auditor will require from sampling, and as a result, the sample size for substantive test of details also can be reduced later on. But again, um, the sample size for substantive test can be reduced because the substantive procedures are uh, added, or meaning if the auditor will perform additional substantive procedures, then he can reduce his sample size, because the reduced amount of sample size, this can be uh, compensated with additional substantive procedures that the auditor will perform, okay, in gathering audit evidences. Okay, so the next factor to be considered is the auditor's required confidence level and risk of incorrect acceptance. What is incorrect acceptance? Meaning the auditor relied on the internal controls of the entity. Okay, for substantive test of details, the auditor's required confidence level, this refers to the level of assurance that the auditor requires that the result of the sample are indicative of the actual amount of misstatement in the population. That is confidence level, because in this case, the auditor will use the sample size to uh, uh, to 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 provide opinion on the entire population. So he has to make sure that this sample size, as well as the result of evaluation of the sample size, is indicative of the actual amount of misstatement as well in the population. Okay, so it is the mathematical complement of sampling risk. Okay, so here, if you could still remember the risk of incorrect acceptance. Okay, so over-reliance of the internal control. Okay, for example, if the risk of incorrect acceptance is 15%, then the auditor's confidence level is 85. Okay, because the risk is only 15%. Meaning confidence level, again, is the level of assurance that the results of the sample are indicative of the misstatement in the population. Okay. So an increase in the auditor's degree of confidence, or conversely a decrease in the risk of incorrect acceptance, will result to increase in the sample size for substantive test of details, because in this case, the auditor will gather more evidence to support his opinion. Okay. So another factor that he should consider is tolerable misstatement. Okay, so tolerable misstatement, this is the monetary amount set by the auditor in respect of which the auditor seeks to obtain appropriate level of assurance that this amount, okay, is not or do not exceed the actual misstatement in the population. Okay, meaning acceptable misstatement. So stated differently, tolerable misstatement, this is an estimate of the maximum monetary misstatement in the account balance or class of transactions with misstatements in other accounts, if that is combined, without causing the FS to be materially misstated. So this is still the acceptable tolerable misstatement. Okay, so the lower the tolerable misstatement, the larger the sample size, because in this case, the auditor should make sure that indeed there is lesser misstatement. But again, this will depend on the what will come out, okay, of his evaluation. Okay. So another factor is expected amount of misstatement. So the expected amount of misstatement, this is the amount of misstatement the auditor expects to find in the population. So this is usually based on the auditor's understanding of the entity's business, prior information, or even the result of the review and evaluation of their internal control. Okay. So the greater the expected amount of misstatement, the larger the sample size, of course, that is for the auditor to detect this misstatement, to make reasonable estimate of the actual amount of error in the population. So next factor is stratification. In this case, if you could still remember, this is grouping, okay, of the classes of transactions, account balance. Okay, when there is variability in the monetary size of the items in the population, it may be appropriate to stratify the population, or in that case also the auditor can group these amounts according to their according to their amounts. Like for example, the auditor will group those items which belongs to lower than 100,000, upper 100,000, below 1 million, upper 1 million. Okay, in performing his substantive procedures. So when population can be stratified, the aggregated of the sample sizes from the strata, so this generally will be less than the sample size that would have been required if the sample has been drawn from the whole population. Okay, because in this case, the items were already grouped. Okay, so that's why it's considered to be lesser. Another factor is the sample or the number of sampling units in the population. So here, sample size normally increases as population size increase. So for large population, the actual size of the population has little, if any, effect on the sample size. This was discussed before in the instance or the case, and if or what is the effect of that in the sample size. Okay, but for larger populations, for example, 50,000, this is infinite already. So the actual size of population has little effect on the sample size in this case. Okay, so this is our summary. Okay, variable sampling, substantive test, a detailed summary of relationship and factors to the sample size. So what will happen? Okay, or what is the amount, of a sample size if this is the case. Okay, if the assessed level of risk of material misstatement increase, okay, risk of material misstatement is higher, then the auditor should increase his procedures. So therefore, he should also increase his sample size to detect more misstatement. Next, use of other substantive procedures detected for the same FS assertion. Okay, in this case, the auditor can decrease or reduce the sample size because, as mentioned earlier, this decrease of the sample size can be compensated on the additional substantive procedures that the auditor will perform. What about for the required confidence level? If this is increased, of course, our sample size will also increase to confirm, indeed, that there is lesser misstatement, or again, depending on the result of the evaluation. Next, risk of incorrect acceptance. Okay, so meaning the auditor, if the risk of incorrect acceptance increase, what will happen? Okay, so the sample size will decrease. Okay, because in this case, if the risk of incorrect acceptance is lower, then increased, so what will happen with the confidence level of the auditor? Okay, it will also it will decrease. Okay, so that's why sample size will also decrease. What about for tolerable misstatement? If this is increased, so the sample size will also increase because there is a greater amount of a misstatement that can be accepted. Okay, what about expected amount of misstatement is increased, of course, the auditor will increase the sample size to detect such misstatement. Stratification increased, okay, so the sample size will decrease, okay, so because in this case the accounts or the balances were already classified, so meaning from the different level of amounts there is a sample that can be taken already. And lastly, for the number of sampling units in the population, if this is increased, so negligible effect, meaning the higher the number of population or sampling units, okay, so there's no effect on the sample size. Okay, so those are the different factors in determining the sample size for substantive test of details.